story. Got it. Thank you. Yep. Yep. That's a great way to get to know people better. But I'm sure it's the most relaxing way you could possibly deal with a stressful situation. A glass of wine in the bathtub. Yes, please. Except if you're presenting. So, well, we're really glad to have everyone here today. Nice to see some familiar faces. We hope to see a lot of new people here. If this is your first time joining us for one of these events, very big welcome to you. We're really glad to have you and excited to talk about, something that's near and dear, I think, to every Southern Californian and probably Northern is the wildlife. We really care about our environment. We really care about water quality. We really care about the plants and animals, especially the native species here. So this is going to be really important. Some of it's going to get a little technical. That's okay. We're going to record this. You can watch it again later. At the end, we're going to have Q&A. You can drop your questions into the chat as we go, or you can raise your hand at the end of the meeting, and we'd be glad to try to answer them the best that we can. And I think that's it. So I'm Melissa Bumstead. I started Parents Against the Santa Susana Field Lab when my daughter was 4 years old in 2014. She was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of cancer. I'm really happy to have Jenny Knack with me. She is fantastic. I live in West Hill. She lives in Simi Valley, and we're two moms who really care about making sure other kids are safe as well as our environment. And then we'll be bringing in Tevin Schmidt, if you want to wave, Tevin.
Good evening, everybody.
And we're very, very pleased to have him with us today. He's a watershed scientist with the Wishtoyo Shumash Foundation. And they've done some excellent work as far as protecting the environment and really getting involved to make sure that they don't just say they care about the environment. His foundation that he works with, they take action. And so we really admire that about them. And we're really grateful that he joined us today. So Jenny, why don't you get us started tonight? You're muted.
Okay. Can you see my screen? Are you able to see the screen? Okay, great. So as she said, Tevin Schmidt is our guest speaker this evening. We're very, very excited. And I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the site history and contamination. And for some reason, I can't.
And just as she's working on that, to let you guys know, we know that a lot of people in this group know this information, especially if you're here last week. You'll notice some of the slides are very the same, but there could be new people. So just bear with us as we kind of go through some of the things you may have already known.
The Santa Susana Field Lab was formerly known as Rocketdyne, established in the late 1940s for rocket testing. In 1949, the AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission, was looking for a place to do their nuclear testing work. And they needed a location that was distant from populated areas. The current SSFL site ranked 5th out of 6 for meteorological safety criteria, but it was still chosen due to the close proximity to UCLA and USC. This is a lab, this is a map of the responsible parties' parcels at the Santa Susana Field Lab. We'll start with Department of Energy in the darker orange in the top left. They've got the northern buffer zone in Area 4 where the nuclear work was done. The middle orange color are NASA's areas. Their larger parcel is Area 2, and they've got a little bit of Area 1 up in the northern portion of the site. The other 3 parcels belong to Boeing, which are Area 3, Area 1 over here, and the southern buffer zone. SSFL was also a rocket engine testing site. Over 30,000 tests were conducted. As you can see, with each test, there's a great deal of contamination being released. But after the test was done, the degreasing agent used is trichloroethylene, TCE. It's a degreasing agent that contaminated the soil. Upwards of 1 million gallons contaminate the soil, and over 500,000 gallons of TCE remain in polluting the groundwater in a toxic plume. These photos are of how hazardous waste was improperly processed at the site. So instead of sending it off-site, which would have been costly and taken more time, they dumped it in these pits. Dozens of barrels would be dumped every month, and you can see in the top left picture, something else they did, they would shoot at them to combust them. That was a practice that was, they were even at that time in violation of the known environmental laws. This is a map of the nuclear work that was done in Area 4. There were 10 nuclear reactors, 4 which suffered accidents. One of those is the infamous SRE, or Sodium Reactor Experiment Partial Meltdown. There are plutonium and uranium fuel facilities, plutonium being one of the most toxic substances known to man. A millionth of an ounce creates cancer with almost 100% certainty in humans. So as we said earlier, there were radioactive accidents, explosions, spills, leaks. As we said, some were unintentional and some were intentional. This is a picture of the SRE, the Sodium Reactor Experiment, where there was a partial meltdown. 13 of 43 fuel elements failed. Instead of what you would see today, where you have the domes protecting the reactors, at this time, those were not yet being utilized. And so instead, that big garage door type image in the right-hand picture was just vented to air the contamination over the site and surrounding areas. Contamination wasn't released just through the air. It is also continuing to be released through stormwater and into the groundwater. And here we see a image of, well, the red line is the site perimeter, and the blue lines are how stormwater is routed through the site, but also how it drains off-site. The drainages to the north go through Meyer Canyon into the Arroyo Simi and the Calleguas watershed. The drainages to the southeast are through Dayton Canyon and Bell Canyon, which is the headwaters of the Los Angeles River, which most of us know eventually leads to the Pacific Ocean. Essesville has the potential to discharge approximately 187 million gallons of stormwater runoff per day, and 60% of that is exiting the site through the south, through the Bell Creek and Dayton Canyon tributaries. As we said, to the north, it discharges into the Arroyo Simi, into the Calleguas Creek watershed. And the issue here is that much of Ventura County and people in the Calleguas Creek watershed are utilizing groundwater for agricultural projects as well as for drinking water. 30% of Simi Valley drinks drinking water through a private company that the EPA states could potentially be polluted from the wells that they're using. Those wells could be polluted by groundwater from underneath SSFL. And we will get into that at next week's water town hall. Although the DTSC will say that contamination does not go off-site, and if it does, it doesn't go off-site above levels of EPA concern. After the Woolsey fire, DTSC assured the public that radioactive particles were not getting off-site. We didn't need to worry. There was no public health issue. We didn't conduct the study, but we did data collection and served as chain of command for an independent peer-reviewed study that showed that indeed radioactive particles that were coming off the lab could be traced back to the lab with a certain signature. More science than I understand. But the interesting thing was we were limited on time and funds, and the furthest extent of our sampling boundary was 9 miles, and our hottest sample was at the end extreme of that boundary. On August 2nd, we can discuss more in depth what these issues of contamination coming off site mean for health impacts, especially for women and children. We will be joined by Dr. Robert Dodge from Physicians for Social Responsibility Los Angeles. We hope that you will register and join us for that evening. And now I'm going to hand it over to Melissa to cover the cleanup agreements.
Thanks, Jenny. Do you want to do the slides for me or my screen sharing? You got it. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to go over this pretty quickly. But again, this is for the sake of understanding how this new agreement and the PEIR is going to put wildlife at harm. So I'm afraid we need a little bit of background. I'll try to keep it brief. In 2007, the DTSC, which is the Department of Toxic Substance Control, they're also the regulating agency over the whole cleanup. They signed an agreement with Boeing, NASA, and Department of Energy. And we'll see in a minute that later NASA and Department of Energy, we call them DOE sometimes, signed a different agreement. So this one still was holding to Boeing. It was going to make Boeing clean up the Santa Susana Field Lab to match Ventura County's open space zoning, which included agricultural and rural residential land uses, because if you've ever been up there, you know, it's exactly what it is. Farmland, people have big properties. They have goats, pigs, chickens, some cows. And this agreement was fairly substantial. It was a pretty good cleanup agreement. Could have been better, but it was, you know, a good start, and it was well supported. You can see the letter to the left there was sent out supporting this cleanup agreement recently in 2021, when it was considered being under threat by several of the local elected officials and governments. So in 2015, Boeing promised a suburban residential cleanup, but in 2017, they took it back and said they would do a significantly less protective recreational cleanup. And then in 2022, we'll see, we're going to get into this settlement agreement, which essentially redefines what a residential with garden cleanup looks like. So instead of it being safe enough to grow vegetables, like actually live on site, which no one will, but if you wanted to, you could hypothetically, and then eat the produce that you grew there, and you wouldn't get cancer from it. And the reason why that was so important is because people, especially Bell Canyon, literally share not a chain link fence that would even be more protective, just a barbed wire fence, which you can get over and under. If you look at it, it's like it's in shambles. They literally share a gate with a fence with the Santa Susana Field Lab. And so this kind of a very protective cleanup would protect the people living right next to the site. Next. But unfortunately, the DTSC was concerned that Boeing would sue. And so they had something they erroneously titled a settlement agreement. And then this settlement agreement, they changed the formulas and a document called the SRAM. We're not going to get into that today because that is a detailed like 4-hour presentation. We've got all the steps to show why that SRAM should not have been changed, and how you can see here in this really nice little chart, instead of making the cleanup stronger, like they had promised us this new Boeing agreement would be, it actually weakened 179 constituents. That's 179 chemicals that we needed to be removed completely to be safe. Well, they weakened how the cleanup agreement would be for those. So that way more contamination is staying on site. Next. But they didn't just do it for human health, which is what we saw in the blue. This is showing the biological receptors. So this is the wildlife. So when you look at those chemicals, you're looking at the effects on human health. They're also looking at wildlife. And you can see that 181 of those chemicals were similarly weakened. Next. So essentially, the takeaway from the 2000 agreement / 2022 Boeing settlement agreement is that they redefined the residential garden standard because they incorrectly changed the standardized risk assessment methodology, SRAM. And that SRAM is the formula to decide how much cleanup needs to happen, how much contamination is safe. So combined, this is going to result in 90 to 95%. And there's a few other factors. Obviously, there's the 5-time multiplier, the 100-time multiplier. We are really shortening this down for you, okay? Because we all know we want to get to the wildlife. We have other Zooms. If you go to our YouTube page, Parents Against SSFL on YouTube, again, you can watch the whole video. We have a 1-hour presentation on just the settlement agreement. That's there for you to learn. So again, I'm rushing through. So nobody point fingers and say, I didn't say it right. We intentionally kept it short. Next. There was a second agreement. This is the 2010, we call it the AOC, the Agreement on Consent. Boeing did not sign it. Boeing refused. NASA and Department of Energy and Department of Toxic Substance Control signed this agreement. And the great thing about it is that it said it was going to clean the background. So get that word stuck in your head, a background cleanup. This is going to become really important when we start talking about the wildlife here, because a background cleanup means that you remove all the man-made contamination and you put it back to its natural state. And again, that was very, very well liked and supported by our federal elected officials. You can see their letter on the left saying that they supported this agreement. And it was really kind of a revolutionary standard to do something that comprehensive, which to me, I mean, okay, let's take a poll. Ready? If you go down to the bottom, we're going to do a little poll. You can see a reactions button. If you think that cleanup always means removing all the contamination, raise your hand, your virtual hand under the reactions. Let's see. Let's take a vote. Okay. So we've got some votes here. We've got some no-shows. All right. Well, let me tell you right now that a cleanup does not guarantee all the contamination to go away. In fact, what Boeing is doing with the DTSC will be called a cleanup, even though they'll leave 95% of the contamination behind. So a background cleanup is revolutionary. It shouldn't be. That's common sense. You take away all the contaminants. That's what we're fighting for. Okay, so next. Now, something really thoughtful. This 2010 agreement was pretty exceptional. It really considered what was going to be the healthiest for the people living nearby, what was going to be the healthiest for the wildlife. I mean, it really considered removing enough contamination to make it safe, right? They took it a step further because the Santa Susana Field Lab has some pretty amazing resources on it. It has wildlife. Some of that is sensitive, threatened, and endangered species that live on site, and also some really special cultural artifacts. And so they put into this agreement some ways to make sure that those didn't get destroyed. Because obviously, if you have an endangered animal, you don't want to destroy it. You would want to work around it. So that's what these exemptions were. They were very narrowly defined, and they were to prevent the total destruction of endangered species and recognized cultural artifacts. Next. So here we have these biological exemptions, these part of that AOC that I just told you about. But there were, they wanted to make sure that there were no loopholes. They didn't want to give NASA and Department of Energy a way to exploit this, right? Because then they wouldn't be protecting people. So they wrote it very clearly, like lawyers do, and they made it specific to say that there had to be, from the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service, a biological opinion with a determination that having this cleanup, it would have to violate two very specific sections of the Endangered Species Act. That's how you get this biological exemption, right? It's not just for anybody, it's not just for anything, it's to make sure that we didn't destroy something that could never be repaired. So it was very specific, written into that original cleanup agreement, how this had to go. And here's the shock, ready? This final PEIR, and up to this point, there has not been that biological opinion, has not been issued. Therefore, there can be no biological exemptions according to the 2010 AOC cleanup agreements, although mitigation measures can be required. And we're going to look at some of those mitigation measures in a second. But what I want to say here real quick is, again, we kind of simplified this, but the fact that that these biological opinions have not been issued means that not only should they not be part of the cleanup, they're not needed to be part of the cleanup. And Tevin might go into this more. We might have some Q&A about it afterwards, but that's important to remember, okay? Let's go to the next slide. So this is shocking. And if you're not shocked yet, you should be now, once I explain it to you. This map, anything that is colored in that bright green teal, the red, and the yellow is a biological or cultural exemption from cleanup according to this new PEIR, Programmatic Environmental Impact Report, that just came out a month or so ago. So what they did is, even though the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service did not give a biological opinion, you can see that DTSC has said they're still going to apply them. They're not just going to apply it to some of the area, they're pretty much covering the entire area. In fact, there's a chart in this 1,000-page document that shows, excuse me, cough break, that 65% of the acreage, and that's their own calculation, 65% of the acreage that should have been cleaned up under the original cleanup agreement will now be left contaminated in forever.
And DOE.
I'm sorry. Oh, I don't know what I said, but that was the right answer. NASA and DOE. NASA and DOE. This is according to the 2010 agreement. So 65% of their acreage will now be left contaminated, according to them, even though there was no biological opinion given, there should be no exemptions. And yet you see almost the whole site. I mean, they took that loophole and they made it into like a Minecraft portal. All right, next. So these are mitigation measures, and these are really great. These were actually really thoughtful in the PEIR. And we're not going to go into them all. We have links down at the bottom. We'll have the PowerPoint available. You can click them. We've got the page numbers for you. You can check them out. But the mitigation measures are probably what you were originally thinking of, or at least I was, when I was thinking about this exemption. Like, well, how do we protect the wildlife during the cleanup, right? Well, this is smart. This is the way to do it. You limit disturbances, like specific locations. You're not going to clean up all the area all at once. You're going to do little sections of it. So if there's wildlife here, they can move over there and then they can go back, right? You have qualified biologists there. Nighttime work will be avoided. During rain events, work shall not happen near aquatic habitats. I mean, these are really smart, thoughtful ways to make sure that the wildlife is protected during the cleanup. Exemption is different. Exemption is saying no cleanup, and they applied it broadly, right? That's not even necessary. Next. So DTSC has thrown out cleanup levels. So this is another problem we have with the PEIR, is they've thrown out the cleanup levels that were meant to protect these biological receptors or wildlife. They're using standards by their own admission that will cause observable adverse effects. Okay, so it's kind of confusing the way that they write these words, but essentially that's the lowest dose at which there will be an observed toxic or adverse effect. This is the new standard that we're seeing in the PEIR, where before it used to say no observable effects on the wildlife harming them. There will now be allowed to be observable effects to the wildlife according to these biological standards that they're using. Next. So similarly, a TRV is it's the toxic. Oh, I forgot. So Kevin, you can jump in if you remember that one. I know you do. TRV.
It's toxicity reference values.
60 rested, but the eco-RIBSLs is the ecological risk-based screening levels. So I got that one down. And you guys will see that in the draft PEIR, this was a comment against DTSC for using creating these ranges of how much contamination, what they'll decide how much contamination harms wildlife, are starting to incorporate things like these LC50s, which is a lethal concentration to 50% of the organisms exposed. So these are the basis of what their DTSC is doing to protect the wildlife. And this is the point I want to get across, is that they're not doing this to protect the wildlife. This is not a protective standard right here that we're looking at. The Lowell is not a protective standard. And yet they're saying that they can't do the full cleanup because they have to protect the wildlife. I hope you guys are seeing the irony on this. Okay, next. Greenwashing, perfect timing. Jenny.
Yay. Okay, if you don't know what greenwashing is, it is the act or practice of making a product, policy, activity, or corporation appear to be more environmentally friendly or less environmentally damaging than it really is. And Boeing is great at this. The sign to your right is a sign at SSFL. It's got the Boeing logo. It says corporate lands for learning. It makes it sound like a college campus as opposed to a very contaminated site that has carcinogens, radionuclides that could threaten the lives of people on site if they were to ingest them. On the left, we have that Wildlife Habitat Council. You see Wildlife Habitat Councils on the sign. Well, over on the left, there are Wildlife Habitat Council awards. In 2018, I think Boeing won 1, 2, 3, 4 awards, along with Bayer and Exelon. And these are industry.
Monsanto has won some from this same Wildlife Habitat Council, same with Exxon.
The winners
Yeah.
are notoriously industry polluters. But in 2021, the Remediation Project Award went to Boeing for the Santa Susana Field Lab and was presented by Boeing to Boeing. Boeing loves the idea of promoting the Santa Susana Field Lab as an open space wildlife haven. They used to conduct Earth Day hikes. You see that most people in those photos are not masked, which makes me think they were not warned about the extensive contamination on site. And they were given the glossy animal and plant field guides that you see on the left to hikers. Parents Against Santa Susana Field Labs started boycotting these hikes, informing people before they got on site the risks of being on site. And we'd like to think that we were effective in Boeing ceasing to hold the Earth Day hikes. Last year, Reuters did a special investigative report on the Santa Susana Field Lab. And what they have shown is that one of the most strategic ways that the EPA is one of their implementation strategies for avoiding cleanups is to do conservation easements. So you're setting the land aside, pretending it's going to be open space that's never touched. I think we all know how precious land is, and who knows what's going to happen generations from now, but it's avoiding remediation by the responsible parties. My least favorite thing that Boeing has done is donating their $1 million to the Annenberg Wildlife Crossing. This has been incredibly popular. Everybody loves a wildlife crossing. I do too. I understand that it helps restore biomes that have been heavily impacted by human development. In this case, this is disingenuous because they are completely ignoring the fact that the wildlife crossing is leading to land directly adjacent to the Santa Susana Field Lab and potentially introducing more animals to an unremediated site that can affect their ability to not only live, but reproduce. And they congratulate themselves on preserving unique heritage and biodiversity in the area. It's shameful. And now what we've all been waiting for, we're going to hand it over to Tevin Schmidt.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Melissa. Can you guys hear me okay? All right, great. Good evening. My name is Tevin Schmidt. I'm the watershed scientist for the Wish Toyo Chumash Foundation. My job with Wish Toyo is as a watershed scientist. I study riparian and freshwater ecology as well as coastal ecology. I also collect samples and do a lot of water quality analysis. I have a lab space at CSU Channel Islands. And I also collect evidence and help inform litigation decisions for the organization. I have a lot of training in wildlife biology and local ecology, and I'm an expert in migratory songbirds of the region. All right, that's enough about me. I'm coming to you guys from Chumash lands, kind of near Carpinteria on this Zoom session, but we're talking about an area that is in the Mishkanakan speaking Chumash region and the Fernandino Tataviam. All right, let's jump into it. So I wanted to start by not talking about wildlife, but just going over some of the big legacy pollutants that are found on site and how they impact local ecology and local wildlife and the sensitive vegetation communities that are found at the Santa Susana Field Lab. So these are, lead, polychlorinated biphenyls. You guys know of them as PCBs, TCE, and other chlorinated solvents, 1,4-dioxane, and perchlorates. All these pollutants found at Santa Susana Field Lab are carcinogens, teratogens. Teratogens are pollutants or contaminants that cause malformation of an embryo. This can lead to birth defects and deformation, and sometimes stillbirths and miscarriages. They cause reproductive harm. They're endocrine disruptors and can cause reproductive failure for sensitive and listed species on site, as well as species in the watersheds downstream of the field lab. Sorry, I'm still on the lead one. I'll keep me there. All right, so let's talk about lead. The charts on the right side of these slides show the list of chemicals historically and still found at the Santa Susana Field Lab site. Lead is a particular concern. It's been found in concentrations of lead exceeding Boeing's NPDES permit. That's a fancy way of saying their stormwater permit. Concentrations of lead in their stormwater runoff has regularly exceeded their permit requirements, and has been found in stormwater running off the site. This runoff enters tributaries of the LA River and Arroyo Simi, like Jenny mentioned. The Arroyo Simi is a tributary of Callegas Creek. These water bodies provide essential habitat for many native amphibian and fish species that are extremely vulnerable to lead contamination. Biomagnification of lead through the food web, like aquatic insect larvae to fish and birds, can result in lead poisoning in insectivorous birds species and secondary predators like tree frogs, toads, and slow swimming fish, like the state listed arroyo chub and partially armored three-spine stickleback. And those species occupying aquatic habitats. Lead ions dissolved in water are easily absorbed into fish gills or amphibian skin and can cause direct sublethal and lethal impacts to these species. And then a couple other anecdotes about lead. Lead poisoning in birds can lead to anorexia, drooped wings and weakness. They have trouble flying and coordinating in flight. And all of these symptoms kind of makes them more vulnerable to predation from other birds or even coyotes or cats. And then what we kind of know of, and of course, I'm not saying this is from SSFL, but one of the anecdotes of lead is that lead led to lead poisoning from hunting ammunition was one of the leading causes of the decline of the California condors in the past century. Just so you guys know how serious lead contamination is. Aquatic wildlife exposed to chronic lead contamination can result in inhibition of metamorphosis. Metamorphosis, we're talking about like how a tadpole changed to a polywog and then to a frog, or dragonfly larva turning into a dragonfly. And it can also cause an inhibition of neurological development and other developmental processes. All right, moving on. That was a real fun slide. That was one contaminant. All right. Sorry, folks. I got to keep my notes up here. All right. We're talking about polychlorinated biphenyls. It's a mouthful, even for somebody who studied water chemistry extensively, but we'll call them PCBs. PCBs are carcinogenic. They cause low birth weight and decline in sperm count. They can suppress immune system function. They also have neurological impacts that impact visual recognition, short-term memory, and can cause learning deficits. One of the main things that you find in studies on wildlife is actually PCBs can cause a decreased thyroid hormone levels. Anybody that knows about or has family members or even experiences issues with their thyroid, it causes a significant amount of issues in life and can and can cause some developmental deficits as well. If you guys are wondering where some of these pollutants come from or why they're on the site in the first place, and why PCBs were ever even invented, PCBs were historically used as coolants and lubricants for transformers, capacitors, and other electronic equipment. Of course, the Santa Susana Field Lab was testing rockets, they were testing nuclear energy, and so there was a lot of this stuff used on site. Okay. Oh boy. Another terrible contaminant, that TCE and other chlorinated solvents. TCEs and chlorinated solvents are used as degreasing agents and degreasing solvents that are used for, the space age aluminum and metals that are used for aerospace. And of course, they use a ton of it. TCE is one of the main issues in with Tucson's water supply right now. Is a massive plume of TCE in one of their groundwater aquifers, and it's a serious issue kind of wherever the Air Force is, and usually where there have been rocket launches in the past, or military bases, because TCE was used a lot. So TCE is a primary concern for groundwater. It's really fast to make it into groundwater supplies. And of course, in the area around Santa Susana Field Lab, I think there's about 28 springs that are actually fed by groundwater. And in ecology, these are called hyporheic, or gaining reaches, or gaining wetlands, where groundwater actually seeps up from the ground and into these habitats. And so these are groundwater dependent ecosystems, or aquifer fed wetlands. And of course, if there's TCE in the groundwater, that can get into sensitive species habitats. TCE is a known teratogen for amphibians and other aquatic wildlife. If you guys remember, I know it's a hard word, but teratogen is a type of contaminant that particularly impacts the embryo and causes malformation of the embryo, which causes those reproduction failures or birth defects. And then TCE is carcinogenic to humans through all routes of exposure. So you get TCE on your skin, you could absolutely get cancer if you breathe in fumes from TCE, or if you ingest TCE. All of these methods are cancer causing. It's a pretty terrifying contaminant, and it's terrifying how easily it gets into groundwater. Okay, 1,4-dioxane. Dioxane was used as a stabilizer for chlorinated solvents. So if you have one contaminant that you regularly use, you gotta stabilize it with another terrible. It seems like a lot of these gotta go hand in hand. But dioxane is causes acute toxicity, or it's acute toxicity from dioxane can cause severe nasal cavity, liver, and kidney damage in humans and wildlife. All right. Yes. Okay. So we've got perchlorate. This is a massive issue on site, and it's a pretty terrifying contaminant as well. Perchlorate, and I talked with Melissa a little bit earlier today, and I guess there are claims that perchlorate comes from a fertilizer in the area, and I said, I told her maybe that's true, maybe there's some perchlorate found in a certain type of fertilizer, but ATF don't come after me. But if you combine a strong oxidizer with a high nitrogen compound like fertilizer, you create a bomb. So I'm pretty certain there's not that much perchlorate in any fertilizer that we're talking about. But what perchlorates are actually used for was a massive development in rocket technology. It's a strong oxidizer that's a really important ingredient in solid rocket fuel. When we develop solid rocket fuel, it's really important for us to get to the moon and get to outer space, because solid rocket fuels take up a lot more space than liquid jet fuels do in fuel compartments. Okay, that's enough rocket science. But anyways, what I'm saying is there's obvious reasons why there's a lot of perchlorate on site, and it's because there's a lot of rocket testing. So perchlorate can completely inhibit iodide uptake, which reduces thyroid hormone production, which further affects normal metabolism, growth, and development of organisms. Perchlorate is also, like many of these contaminants, a known carcinogen. Okay, so now that we've gone through some of the contaminants and what they do or what their toxicity does to wildlife and some plants, we can kind of talk about some ecology and some of the ecological impacts of pollutants in general. And so this is actually a great little graphic of bioaccumulation versus biomagnification. Some of you folks might have heard about this in environmental science courses, or if you've read some articles about issues, or even if you've heard about certain legacy pollutants that have affected our everyday life. And so the top graphic is a fish. So that's one single individual that through its life, and this is a fish, so it absorbs a lot of, fish are designed to absorb dissolved oxygen through their gills. And so when they're in an aquatic environment that has contaminants, it will, fish will absorb contaminants in that water through their gills. And those contaminants make it into their tissues and actually end up, staying in the tissues of the fish and in its organs. And so through its lifetime, as it continues to collect these contaminants from its surrounding environment, or if it's eating like bugs and little insect and larvae and insect larvae that has those contaminants in them, through its lifetime, it will have more and more and more and more of those toxins in its body, and more of its biomass will be made up of these toxins. And so bioaccumulation, of course, happens in a bunch of different species, but also happens, or a bunch of different wildlife species, but it also happens in plants. And this next, the graphic at the bottom here shows a number of trophic levels. So these are levels, think of trophic levels as pieces of the food chain. So the lowest trophic level will typically be plants or algae, your primary producers. And then the second trophic level will be like insects or small rodents that eat plants and plant material. And above that will be your mesopredators, your secondary predators that feed on that, I guess, second trophic level, the insects and the small rodents. And I'm so sorry. I hope everybody's still with me here on the ecology lecture. I'm trying to make it exciting. And so what this shows, though, is that if you have plants that have a little bit of toxicity or a little bit of the contaminants in their tissues, and you have insects that eat a bunch of those plants, there's going to be a magnification just to that first level, because that one cricket is going to eat 10 whole plants in its lifetime, in its short little lifetime. So it's got 10 plants worth of contamination in that one cricket. And then a bird, let's say a thrasher or a towhee, is going to eat a ton of those crickets. And so that's another magnification to that trophic level. Then that towhee could get eaten by a Cooper's hawk or a red-tailed hawk or a bobcat. And that bobcat's going to eat a bunch of those birds or a bunch of those mesopredators or rodents or anything like that. And it's going to have an even greater amount of contaminants in its body. And so like in that bottom graphic, the hawk or the eagle that's sitting on the rock has the highest amount of biomagnification that it has experienced. So I hope that was a good description of biomagnification. One of the things that we learn about in school, a really good example, is the bald eagle or the peregrine falcon or the brown pelican when it came to DDT. And those species were most impacted by DDT because they were the top of their food chain. Pelicans eat really large fish species, and those fish species eat smaller fish species, and which have eaten even smaller fish species, which have eaten zooplankton and plankton that had absorbed this DDT. And so they had massive biomagnification through that food chain, and that's why those top predators were really impacted by DDT. Okay, moving on. Okay, so now that we can talk about a trophic cascade, an event or an impact to a certain part of the food web that can impact the entire food web. And so is an event that involves changes to the structure of an ecosystem that results from changes to animals or plants at one or more levels of the food chain. And so we talked about, some of the issues that might cause bald eagles to go extinct, or species that are impacted by certain contaminants. A good example of a trophic cascade, in the 20s, gray wolves were extirpated from the Yellowstone Valley. And after that happened, the population of elk and deer exploded. And the browsing, or the ungulate overfeeding of aspens and young and sapling trees actually completely decimated multiple generations of aspens and other trees in the Yellowstone. And so you actually had Yellowstone's wild because of what happened. So between 1920 and like the 90s, there was no recruitment from aspen trees, like whatsoever, especially along the Gallatin River. And so you had the disappearance of an apex predator in an area was starting to cause an absolute ecosystem collapse. You had beavers disappeared from the Gallatin River. You had species like grizzly bears, brown bears, and coyotes had less food to scavenge from because there was less wolf kill. And so there's all these issues because the apex predator was taken out of the ecosystem, and Yellowstone was looking at an ecosystem collapse. And similar things can happen here. If a lot of pollutants cause chlorosis or issues with photosynthesis with plants in the area, like heavy metals and radionuclides cause issues with plants, that's the basic level. That's the first trophic level, right? Everything depends on that for food. And so if plants start to die off or have issues from all this contamination, you see I mean, that could kill off a whole food web of organisms. Now, of course, there are still plants on site, so that's less likely. However, you start to see the disappearance or the reduction of certain animals, like mountain lions have their population is diminished significantly in the area. That can cause an explosion of certain rodents in the area, and those overeat plants and vegetation and leaves less food for other things. And so it kind of hurts the whole food web. Okay. Now we can get into how these pollutants specifically impact food webs and certain organisms on site. So the contaminants found at the Santa Susana Field Lab are known to depress invertebrate populations and inhibit essential functions of photosynthesis and plant life. So heavy metals pollutions, radionuclides, perchlorates are known to actually depress invertebrate populations, and invertebrates are a really important part of the food chain. Think about how many different bugs and beetles and ants, bees there are in the world, and how many things actually eat them. I mean, there's an entire family of birds just called flycatchers. There's an entire other family of birds just called gnatcatchers. So you can imagine how much food those insects actually take up, or how much part of the food web those insects take up. Yeah, okay, we'll keep going. Okay, so rodents, reptiles, amphibians, and small birds all rely on plant material. We've got seeds, leaves, fruit, and abundant invertebrate populations for the majority of their sustenance. This is an arroyo toad, by the way, a funny looking endangered. It's not funny looking. They're pretty, but I don't know. I like toads in a funny way. All right, we'll keep going. Impacts to lower trophic levels, like we just talked about, insects, plants, have dramatic impacts to meso and apex predators. Meso predator would be a coyote, an apex predator would be a mountain lion. Impacts to meso and apex predators through biomagnification and bioaccumulation of contamination and decreased food supply. So although some mesopredators like coyotes have proven to be somewhat resilient to habitat fragmentation and like urban sprawl of humanity, these mesopredators like foxes, coyotes, and skunks are still particularly vulnerable to environmental pollution and contamination of their food sources. Okay, impacts to mountain lions. Mountain lions, as we've discussed, have already experienced a significant population decline and bottlenecking. A population bottleneck is an event or series of events that results in the dramatic reduction of a species population and the dramatic decline in genetic variation of that population. So that means there could be inbreeding because there's so few individuals left. As apex predators, mountain lions are the most vulnerable to biomagnification of the contaminants found at Santa Susana Field Lab. Keep going. So contaminants that act as endocrine disruptors can further compound issues with decreasing genetic diversity and inbreeding. So things that impact the reproductive success, their ability so endocrine disruptors can do anything from make an animal a hermaphrodite. It could reduce sperm count in males. It could cause serious reproductive harm to female mountain lions. And so if you add that on top of them already having a smaller population and already having some of these genetic issues, you're really compounding issues for mountain lions in the area. And contaminants from Santa Susana Field Lab that impact the effectiveness of the immune system will undoubtedly further impact the population that is already declining due to anticoagulant rodenticides. So mountain lions in the Santa Monica Mountains, where there's a lot of urban sprawl and suburban sprawl, they are particularly impacted by anticoagulant rodenticides like difascinone and chlorophacinone. These anticoagulants move up through the food web, and rats and mice eat them. And then through those trophic levels, biomagnify in bobcats and mountain lions. Sometimes an anticoagulant poison like that could just kill a mountain lion just like that from internal bleeding and issues like that. But most of the time, an interesting phenomenon happens in mountain lions and bobcats. That type of rodenticide causes immune issues that make the mountain lions more susceptible to mange, and they can actually die from mange, which is a terrible way to go. It's a terrible like skin parasite, and they pretty much just fall apart. It's a really sad and terrifying way to go. And so if you add something like PCBs and perchlorate into their food web, that's just another thing that's depressing that immune system on top of the rodenticides in the area. Okay, keep going. So the surrounding area and watersheds in this region and around Santa Susana Field Lab, there are at least 17 federally listed species, and of course some state listed species as well. So a couple examples of this, we've got right in the, I guess, center left, we've got our beautiful California red-legged frog. It's our largest native frog in Western North America. And then some examples of some state listed species. We've got the two-striped garter snake. They need riparian ecosystems mostly. They're a beautiful little snake. And then we have our coast horn lizard, also called the Blainville's horn lizard. And we have the loggerhead shrike. Those are some state listed species of special concern. And then down at the bottom, we've got some of my favorite insectivorous birds. We have the least Bell's vireo and the coastal California gnatcatcher. And I'm sorry, I'm not a botanist, but I do still have some love for our plants here. On the left side, we have Broughton's milk vetch, and below a little a Kino checker spot. Okay. Yes, okay. If anybody remembers from that last slide, this is a least Bell's vireo, an insectivorous bird that relies on willow and mulefat scrub and riparian woodlands. They are a migrating breeder, and I love them. So, oh, I'm so sorry. Here we go. All right, yeah, so we've got a little bit to talk about these guys. So insectivorous birds, like the least Bell's vireo and the coastal California gnatcatcher, which are federally listed endangered species, and the southwestern willow flycatcher, are dependent on healthy invertebrate populations. which, as we mentioned before, can be significantly depressed by some of the heavy metals, perchlorates and PCBs that are found on site. Okay. How am I doing on time? Am I pacing this okay?
It's 7:30 now. I think what we can say is that if we can wrap it up in the next 5 or 10 minutes, we'll have some time for
Okay.
Q&A.
Okay, gotcha.
Doing great. I'm learning a ton. I love it. I feel like I should get an honorary degree after this, so I really appreciate that. And then anyone who has to jump early, we are recording this. We'll be sending out an email with a link, so don't worry if you do have to go. We'll make sure you get to see all this great information.
Okay, we'll be super fast. So in terms of, so another endangered species is our Broughton's milkvetch. And some of the, so radionuclides and heavy metals on site can cause chlorosis, inhibition of growth and photosynthesis. So the things that make plants live and reproduce are altered by some of these contaminants. Also altered water balance and nutrient assimilation and senescence. Senescence is pretty much just a fancy way of saying the plant's gonna die. All right, let's keep going. Okay, so impacts to our amphibians in the area. Of course, we have our California red-legged frog and arroyo toad. We also have a couple of tree frogs and a western toad subspecies, the California toad. Amphibians breathe using their skin, meaning their skin is more permeable. It's a more permeable membrane than us mammals. The intake of dissolved oxygen through this permeable membrane make amphibians vulnerable to the intake of harmful chemicals like lead and chlorinated solvents that are found on the Santa Susana Field Lab and found in the runoff that makes it to aquatic habitats of the LA River and Arroyo Simi. Next slide. Yeah. Tell you what, we're going to discuss this a little bit more further on. And then a wonderful quote from a ecotoxicologist, Frank von Hippel: if the property is not safe for people, then it certainly is not safe, not safe for wildlife. Very true. Okay, so starting off with this one, or not starting off, but every single quarterly NPDES monitoring report from the Santa Susana Field Lab. So that's every single monitoring report of stormwater and surface water flows from the site. Every single quarterly report that coincides with a rain event includes an exceedance of pollutants in surface water leaving the site. These surface water pollutants reach the LA River and Arroyo Simi, a tributary of Cayugas Creek. The LA River and Cayugas Creek watersheds are home to a multitude of sensitive aquatic wildlife, including endangered amphibians and state-protected slow-swimming fish species like the partially armored three-spined stickleback and arroyo chub. Surface waters of the Arroyo Simi and Cayugas Creek are also diverted and used for agricultural irrigation, with much of this water growing crops in the Camarillo and Oxnard Plain. It's highly likely that we have all eaten a strawberry from this region that could have been watered with contaminants from Santa Susana Field Lab. Okay, talking about mitigation measures, part of my job is reviewing CEQA documents. So I happen to know a little bit about this. So the environmental review process through CEQA requires not only the analysis of environmental impacts, but also mitigation measures that can mitigate those impacts to the environment. And in the EIR for the remediation, it includes specific biological mitigation measures to include weed management plan and a revegetation plan that requires a restoration ecologist to draft a revegetation and restoration plan. Coast sage scrub, California grasslands, and chaparral vegetation communities are well adapted to disturbance. They're going to be okay if areas are remediated, especially with the mitigation plans in place. These communities are naturally resilient to fire, ungulate browsing, and general disturbance. Revegetation plans for these communities done properly will see these sensitive habitats restored within a few years of restoration. For an example, the Woolsey fire destroyed a large percentage of coast sage scrub in the Santa Monica Mountains. The first 2 to 3 years after the fire, it was difficult to find certain sage scrub obligates like California thrashers. I do a lot of point counts for the National Park Service in the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. And for a couple of years, we just didn't get thrashers at all. However, 5 years later, I observed thrashers on close to 70% of all of my point counts this spring. So it's obvious that these vegetation communities have returned because their obligates are returning in these point counts. Okay. At the end of the day, there will likely be short-term impacts from remediation effort on site. However, there are countless long-term impacts that are currently impacting local wildlife communities at the site and watersheds into which SSFL drains. These pollutants must be cleaned up for the protection and benefit of sensitive ecosystems, wildlife, and communities found in the Santa Susana Mountains. The EIR drafted for the remediation effort includes mitigation measures that mitigate the short-term impacts of remediation efforts on sensitive biological communities and resources. By refusing to remediate most of the site to background standards, most of these pollutants will remain on site, continuing to pollute groundwater, surface water, and the habitats of sensitive species and charismatic megafauna like mountain lions, bobcats, coast horned lizards, golden eagles, and frogs and toads. All right, we'll wrap it up there. Off to you, Melissa.
Oh, okay, great. Well, first of all, Kevin, thank you. That was, again, like I said, my brain is like pulsing right now with all this new information. I love biology. I think I missed my calling. So our final point here is that a cleanup protects wildlife. Boeing has spent a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of greenwashing. In fact, the settlement agreement is a giant greenwashing document. This PEIR is saying that their biggest claims are that this is to protect, it's going to protect the wildlife by not cleaning up most of the site. But we would like to just remind everyone that these entities polluted, they're the polluters. They had pristine environment. They broke known environmental laws that they even knew back then. They spent decades harming the land, the water, and the wildlife. And then they didn't care, right? They were reckless. What's the word? The space cowboys. I've heard that term thrown around lately. There's just this idea like we can do anything. We're creating the world. We're creating the atomic bomb. It was just this age of scientific recklessness, and it harmed the environment. And then DTSC now wants to claim that this is going to, now they're going to save the environment. They switch sides along with the polluters, like, oh, we were really bad to the environment. Well, now we're really good to the environment by leaving all the contamination on site. It doesn't make sense. And we want to just propose that a complete background cleanup, it removes all of that man-made contamination and it returns it to its native state where wildlife cannot just live, but can thrive. And that's really what we want to see, because our actions now are going to impact, thousands of years down the line. And we need to make sure that cleanup creates that healthy, safe environment for our wildlife and for the people living nearby. Next steps. We'll put this in the chat. We're asking people to email their supervisors and to remind them that we care about the cleanup. Sometimes they just need to hear it from their constituents. And so here in Ventura County, there's some messages that you can do. In Los Angeles, some of the supervisors who are closest to the site and involved, you can send them a simple message, or, when we send out the slides, you can copy and paste this if that's easier for you, that you're concerned that this DTSC's report is not going to protect the environment. And you can even tell them why wildlife matters to you, why the cleanup matters to you. So last slide. Hey, that's a cool shirt. Wow, what a bumper sticker. Wouldn't you like to be the owner of that? You can on our website, Parents Against Santa Susana Field Lab /swag. And we've got some shirts, some magnets, some stuff that you can wear to help remind people that, when you go out and about, we need to get the conversation going. We need to have more people aware that this is happening, because if we don't act now, we're going to see those long-term effects that Tevin was talking about. So you can email us if you have questions that we didn't get to today. I know we're running short on time. We might have time for a few Q&A. And you can join our mailing list. Jenny, yes.
I just wanted to jump in. We do have a question or two from Kit.
Okay.
The first question he has, there's two. The first question is on TCE. Isn't it true? Sorry, that there's an underlying chemical foundation that TCE and DDT have in common? This is going to be a Tevin question.
Uh-oh.
Hold on, I'm just gonna do the second part of the question is due to its chemical composition, that it's unusually well suited to polluting groundwater and difficult to remove.
That is correct. Yeah, I mean, yeah, at its most basic level, TCE it has a phenomenal chemical capability or ability to intrude groundwater aquifers and pollute groundwater. I'm sorry, what was the second part? I think I guess I can just confirm that.
Well
Yes.
suited to polluting groundwater and difficult to remove. He has another question, which maybe Melissa, you want to take, which is if 500,000 gallons of TCE remain in the SSFL aquifer, as stated, do the experts have an understanding of how that filters in the LA River and into the Arroyo Simi?
Well, I'm going to let Dan take that one over. When I said in the Chatsworth Aquifer, I meant that the plume itself reaches into the Chatsworth Aquifer. That 500,000 gallons is not specific to just the Chatsworth Aquifer. But Dan, is that a question you can help answer for Kit? You guys, this is Dan Hirsch, our technical expert. He's the president of Committee to Bridge the Gap, an independent watchdog group, and the retired program director for UCSC's Program for Nuclear and Environmental Policy. And then Dory, we see your hand. We'll get to you, I promise.
Hi,
Dan,
Kit.
thank you.
Can you hear me? So TCE is not permitted in water at levels over 5 parts per billion. So you have some idea of how much water can be contaminated by 500,000 gallons of TCE being in the soil and the groundwater. That plume has already, and in fact, years ago, moved off-site. And the groundwater, because the facility is up on a hill, that groundwater flows downstream into other aquifers. How much has moved into other aquifers and how much other chemicals as well is not well known. The UCLA study by Dr. Cohen indicated numerous migrations of contaminants off-site. The fundamental point is one needs to clean up the source or it will continue to migrate. And I do want to indicate that cleaning up the TCE in the groundwater is very difficult because it's a fractured bedrock system. But again, that's why the decades of delay and the of cleaning up the groundwater and the delay in cleaning up the soil are so troubling, because all the contaminant that remains in the vadose zone, the area above the aquifer, is available to continue to migrate into the groundwater every time it rains.
And yeah, groundwater remediation in general is very difficult. You often have to pump water from the contaminated plume in the aquifer into an advanced water purification system. And then it's either just discharged out to a river or water body, surface water body, and then or they have to inject it back into their groundwater wall at a different location and just hope that the plume stops spreading. But it is an extremely difficult chemical. It's also hard to treat even at the advanced water purification facility. So yeah, it's a serious issue.
I think, Dory, did you want to go first and then Julie? Dory, can you unmute?
Yeah, it kind of took me a while there.
Yay.
Well, then I have two questions. One is like with the LA Water Board, were they getting any money or something from Boeing because of how they voted? And then the other one, I know you didn't discuss about tritium. How do you clean up tritium in water?
Dan, can you answer the question about money exchanging between the responsible party and the water board? I can't answer that.
I think that the question you're getting at is more complicated. I think it is the influence of Boeing's well-connected lobbyists with the governor, who appoints the members of the Regional Water Board, that resulted in the fiasco a year ago of the water board chair being asked to resign, given his concerns about this proposed deal. And then the rest of the water board members getting the message that if they didn't vote the way they were being told to vote, that could happen to them too. As to tritium, tritium is the radioactive isotope of hydrogen, and it generally appears in the form of tritiated water. HTO, in other words, one of the hydrogen atoms is radioactive. And therefore the tritium can't be filtered out of the water because it's part of the water. So to deal with the tritium plume, you need to extract the water and electrolyze it, separate out the tritium. And we're about to face the Fukushima reactor dumping vast amounts of tritium into the ocean. So they really did a beautiful job of messing things up there. We've talked about two of the more difficult matters to remedy. Most of the cleanup is pretty simple. It's not rocket science. And they've just resisted it because it's cheaper to hire a lobbyist than it is to spend the money to clean up the mess they're responsible for.
Thank you. Julie, do you want to go?
Yeah,
Julie,
please.
I think you'll be our last question for
Yeah,
the.
and this may be a question for Dan, I'm not sure. So people living in Simi Valley currently now, are there wells that are contaminated that is mixed with the drinking water there? And is it the whole entire Simi Valley? Is it partial? What's the story now?
So some years ago, the city of Simi found perchlorate in a dewatering well in the western part of Simi Valley. Toxics Agency said it couldn't be true because their model, quote unquote, said that no contaminants could migrate off the site. Idiocy. So EPA the following year came and took measurements and confirmed the perchlorate. DTSC still said it couldn't be a correct reading because their model said it couldn't happen. And then they took a sample and found the perchlorate as well. This led to the water board, the regional water board, requiring measurements at a significant number of monitoring wells in Simi Valley, where they found perchlorate in about a third of the wells. And in particular, there have been monitoring results from the two main supply wells in Simi Valley that supply a significant fraction of the drinking water in Simi Valley. And I want to be clear, the perchlorate in those wells, or at least in the water that's supplied to the public after blending, is below the legal limit. It's above, however, the state's revised public health goal based on new science. And the state hasn't gotten around to revising the legal limit. Perchlorate's a pretty bad contaminant, as you've heard, and it tends to be a precursor for other contaminants that follow because it moves faster than others. Julie, you have I'm not being clear for you.
Yeah, there are two water districts I've been researching it because a family member is moving there in that area in the West End. There are two separate water districts. Do they both have wells that are used to be blended in with their water, drinking water?
I don't know. I'm only aware of one company that is providing a significant fraction of the water in Simi Valley and that relies on these two wells, Sycamore and
That's a-
Niles wells.
That the Golden State or Golden something, yeah, that's.
Golden State, but I want to be clear, they're not doing anything illegal. The problem here is that the state's limit is archaic.
I understand. I can't remember the other one. Ventura something is the other.
And I don't know if that one relies on groundwater or not. I don't know.
All right. Because I wondered if you have young children, et cetera, should they be drinking bottled water or
Julie,
not?
sorry to interrupt you. I'm a Golden State Water customer. We do sparklets. So if they happen to buy a house that's on that system, we do not drink the water, but we do bathe in it. And a very expensive solution for most of the contaminants is a reverse osmosis system. But what we price that at is about $4,000 for the whole house. And for a community that is largely working class, that becomes a environmental justice issue.
Right, so that's Golden State, but the Ventura one, we don't know exactly about
I
that
don't
one.
know, but I do know that next week we're going to talk more about water and all the multiple myriad of issues concerning groundwater, stormwater, drinking water at us. So
That
next
would be
week,
very helpful, but you're saying you do like a reverse osmosis with you
I can't afford that.
Oh, I see.
We shouldn't have to. And my personal opinion is they shouldn't be using that water, but that's my personal.
Thank you very much. I appreciate all the information. Thank you.
Julie, just as a reminder for next week, if you come on, make sure you ask us about tritium and Golden State Water. So
Okay.
that's your little teaser for next week. I don't think we have any more questions right now. I know I learned a lot. I certainly learned that if I got it right, that amphibians breathe through their skin or drink through their skin. How did that work?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. Well, the funniest example of this is the Lake Titicacan frog. They have to have a lot of folds in their skin because the lake is at such a high elevation and air pressure is so low. So they have to have a lot of surface area to breathe. So yeah, yeah,
That
frogs
is
breathe through their
remarkable.
skin.
I hope you all learned more than that today, but that was still pretty, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. So thank you guys again so much. Please help us get the word out that we need to protect our wildlife, that this is a very critical issue. And again, to take action by emailing your elected officials, your supervisors, your mayors, your state assembly members, senators, whatever we can do to make noise is going to help. And this is so critically important. So thank you all for taking the time. Tevin, a special thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. It was very appreciated. And again, follow up with questions and we'll have this as a recording. And I hope you guys have a great night. Good night.
Thank you,
Good night.
Jenny, Melissa. Thank you guys so much for organizing all this and getting information out. You guys are incredible. Kit, thank you for your reporting. And Daniel, thank you so much for all the work you do.
If we didn't have an expert like Dan, we would have been sunk before we even started. That's the truth.
Yeah.
So, hey, Jenny, just a reminder, when you turn this off, it's going to ask you how to save the recording.
Okay.
If you have enough memory on your computer, go ahead and save it to your desktop.
Okay.
And then we can upload it to YouTube. Otherwise, you can save it to the cloud.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Good night.